Okay, welcome to our discussion this morning. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm editor-in-chief of Quartz. We're a global business news site that developed this session with the World Economic Forum. I'd like to also welcome the people who are following us on video, both on Quartz's site, on Facebook Live, and on the site of our partner, Yahoo Finance, as well. So the goal of this section is to tackle one of the more urgent questions of our time. How can the governance of globalization be improved? And what we're talking about here, for clarity, is international economic integration, where we're talking about globalization. This is admittedly not a new topic for Davos, but I would argue that it's as urgent as ever, given the power that the critics of globalization are coming into now. And with technology, we're seeing that it's easier than ever for jobs to be replaced or moved from country to country, which is an important dimension of this question. So the questions are, what can be done to make globalization work for more people? What can we learn from the last 20 years? And what are the responsibilities of businesses and of states? So we have a very distinguished panel here who's committed to answering these questions by the end of the hour that we're spending together. And I'll start by introducing them very quickly. Sitting next to me is Stefan Löfven. He's the Prime Minister of Sweden. He has a trade union background, which is an interesting element to this discussion, especially relevant. Sitting next to him is Brad Smith. He's the President and the Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft, where he heads legal, government affairs, public policy. And I would note that Microsoft in its fiscal year 2016 got more than half of its $85 billion in revenue outside of the United States, its home country. Sitting next to Brad is Dambisa Moyo. She's an economist. She's an author. She's a member of the board of a number of companies, including Barclays Bank, Barrick Gold, and others. And in the final chair over there, there's Abid Nimichwala. He is the chief executive of the Indian technology firm Wipro, which has over 170,000 employees, clients on 6 continents, and its revenue spread throughout the world. So for those of you in the audience here today, we're going to take questions and reactions at the end, and so we'd like to involve you in the discussion. And I want to start by asking a foundational question of this room, which is, do you believe that globalization has been a net positive for society? So I'd ask those of you who believe that globalization is a net positive for society, would you raise your hand right now? Can we get a sense of the room?
We're sitting at
Okay.
the
Well, it's mixed. 60% say it's positive, a little bit more. Did the panel raise their hand? I missed.
I did that.
Okay. All right, thank you.
They're a bit more hesitant.
Yes, we'll come to that.
So we did a similar poll on Facebook, and we had 1,400 responses, and these are people who follow the World Economic Forum, so it's probably not a totally representative set, but 73% of the people who we polled said that globalization was a net positive for societies. We also put out a call on social media several weeks ago about this topic, and several hundred people responded. We interviewed a number of them by video, and I'm going to try and bring their voices into this discussion today. And I'm going to start, before I turn to the panelists, we're going to start with one of them, and it's a woman named Magdalena in Singapore. And so we're going to play the video of Magdalena right now, talking about globalization.
Entire industries that are being displaced or made irrelevant, or wages in those industries being suppressed. So people in those industries will be very much affected. On the other hand, people in the sunrise industries are finding that the world's never been better, the economy for them has never been better.
So she's describing, Magdalena in Singapore is describing a world where there are winners and losers as a result of globalization. And so I'm going to start with that question for the panel. And I'll start with you, Mr. Prime Minister. Who are the winners and losers of globalization?
Well, first, I think we need to look at the history and see that the recipe for good societies has been that people in general can see, well, there has been a kind of promise, the future will be better. I can promise my kids a better future than I had in the present. That had been kind of a contract. And as been described now, yes, there are winners, of course, but there are also losers, and that is the dangerous thing right now. And there's no wonder that people also oppose globalization because they fear what is happening. One of the losers are those who have a low education, for example, to be more concrete. Those are one of the, we can see that in Sweden. If we compare unemployment for young people without an upper secondary school, with those who do that, have that, and also a university degree, it's a huge difference. Those without upper secondary school, the unemployment for youth is like 35–40%, but much, much lower for those with higher education. So that is one theme that we need to focus on. How do we make sure that everybody can have the education, not only the basic education, but also the lifelong learning to keep up with the pace of change? So I would say that is a concrete difference.
Okay, so education is an important thing.
Yes.
Dambisa, I may pull you in. Who would you say are the winners and losers of globalization?
So let's perhaps take a moment to just frame the issue of globalization. If we take a step back into the 1980s, we were promised, and certainly in the Washington Consensus, we were promised a suite of goods, essentially. We were promised free trade in goods and services. We were promised, which is also a key pillar of the globalization agenda, cross-border capital flows. We were promised, and with clear intention, that there was going to be free movement of people. And then, of course, as part of the Washington Consensus, there was a discussion around the size of government. If we take the snapshot of where we are today, we know that there continue to be massive protectionism before the Trump sort of wrath of protectionism coming. We already know that the World Trade Organization has talked about trade declining over the last decade, and the fact that even just in the last year, according to the Global Trade Alert, we've had about 644 new tariffs imposed, and the most aggressive being the United States. Cross-border capital flows, you mentioned I sit on the bank board, and we know since the financial crisis, we have seen increasing capital controls, which have limited cross-border flows. If you look at the International Institute of Finance data, we actually are seeing flows to the emerging markets that are so low. The last time we saw them at those levels was in the 1980s. And then in terms of immigration, we know that the agenda has not become globalized. We have the World Trade Organization on trade, IMF focusing on governance around cross-border capital flows, but we've never had an international agency focused on immigration. We'll come to that discussion later, but I think just to answer your question very succinctly, who were the winners, who were the losers? Clearly, the losers have been farmers in emerging markets, because many of them are facing subsidies through the EU, farm subsidies in the United States, EU CAPS, the CAP program, the Common Agriculture Policy Program, so they've not been able to sell their goods into the international market. Other losers, clearly, in the United States, middle class. We know the story about real wages. We know the story about living standards and the deterioration in a lot of the social metrics, not just for minority groups, but also for mainstream Americans. In terms of winners, and I think many of us put our hands up, it is clear that there has been a decrease. If you look at the income inequality between countries, there has been a decrease over the years. So, coming to the point about improvements of society, reduction of poverty, I mean, those statistics are clear. And I think the reason President Xi was speaking on behalf of globalization is China, with I think the number he quoted was 700 million people moved out of poverty in the last several decades. I mean, that is definitely on the back of globalization. But I think one of the things that we are going to have to come to terms with here is that there have been significant losses, and it's not clear to me that we'll be able to remedy them under the current infrastructure.
And you make an interesting point, which is that the problem with free trade is it's not truly free, or it's not free enough.
We've never gone far enough. In all of these metrics, we've never had full immigration, we've never had full trade, and we've never had full cross-border capital flows. And so therefore, globalization is not actually
for some
existed.
of the distortions.
Yeah.
There's an important dimension of this, which is technology. And so there's some research that suggests that a lot of what people attribute to the disruption around globalization is, in fact, there changes in technology that affect people's jobs. And so before we get into this, I'm going to we have another person, it's Gabriela Ivan in Romania, who responded to our call and has a few thoughts on this question specifically, so we'll play that right now.
I think the challenge, especially among young people, in terms of employment, I was just looking at Romania's figures, and this year, 2016, we had 20.4% unemployment rate among young people. And I think the forces that drive this rate of unemployment in the workforce is the new economy, the new digital economy, and globalization.
So in Romania, she's saying there's 20% unemployment among young people, and she's pointing a finger at technology and the new economy for being responsible for this. Abid, I want to come to you. Historically, as technology has displaced jobs, it has created new ones. Do you worry that this time is different? I think that's what might be her worry.
So there definitely is a asymmetry. There are two trends which are happening. Number one is technology. This is clearly not how the first, second, or third industrial revolutions have happened. So the impact is much bigger on jobs. And second is the speed of the change is much faster this time, and societies take time to adjust. I think we've not given enough time to the impact of technology and globalization because of the speed at which it has happened. And those are the two factors probably which hurt. But I agree, the productivity, the labor productivity, and a lot of GDP growth has come because of technology, which has been jobless productivity that has come in.
Brad, I want to pull you in. Microsoft is among the leading companies with resources and skills in artificial intelligence, and that right now is among the preoccupations that people have. It's potentially not just robots assembling cars, but it's artificial intelligence that could affect even more white-collar employment. How do you see that?
Well, I would actually first step back a little bit and think about everything that everybody's been saying. And let me just quote a couple of numbers from the United States.
Yeah.
You take your first question, has globalization been net good? Well, there was a Georgetown University study last June that said since 1989, the US economy has added 35 million jobs. If your definition is net equals overall, 35 million additional jobs in 26 years is very good progress. What is more insightful is then to see how it breaks down. The number of jobs held by Americans that have a 4-year college degree or higher has risen 107%. It has more than doubled. And the rate of growth, the slope of the curve, is remarkably constant through Republican and Democratic administrations alike. Now, if you look at the so-called middle-skilled jobs, those that require a post-secondary credential, typically a community college degree, those have risen, but by not as much, by 47%. And the slope of the curve has been much more jagged. Now, the really amazing thing is what has happened to jobs that are held by people who have only a high school diploma, a secondary degree, or less. It has fallen by 13%. There are 7.3 million fewer jobs in the United States today than there was in 1989, held by people with only that level of education. And if you ask people, including me, well, would more trade have solved that problem? I don't think so.
Yeah.
It requires a different solution. Now, your question sort of points to both an additional aspect of the problem and part of the solution. Those 26 years have been a time of increasing trade and massive technological change. It's not as if automation is just starting in the year 2017. A lot of these jobs that were adversely impacted have been eliminated by technology at times. And what we have to think about in the future is what jobs will be added, but equally important, what skills will be needed. If we don't understand what skills will be needed, and if we don't match the people with the right skills with the new jobs, then actually, whether it grows on net probably doesn't matter unless you actually don't need a net.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that question specifically. What are the skills that are needed? I want to ask you, Mr. Prime Minister, so, as I mentioned, your background is in trade unions, and so I'd like to ask you how workers and organized labor feels about this question of automation and how they should be thinking about it.
Well, I think they feel differently depending on knowledge and competence level. But in general, I would say in Sweden, I told you, I was telling our moderator about a quote from a local trade union representative at the SKF factory in Gothenburg. He later became the mayor of that city. And he said when he was asked by a journalist, this is 2 decades ago, the company had invested in new technology, which also meant that they need fewer workers. Mm-hmm. And he was asked by a journalist, are you not afraid of this new technology that actually takes away jobs from this factory? And he said, no, I'm afraid of the old technology. And I think that it is a very wise response, because he also understood if we do not use this new technology, the whole factory will be gone in perhaps 5 or 10 years. So the thing is, and also we need to be aware of this, you cannot stop the development of new technologies. It's impossible, it will happen. And we need it. It's basically a good thing. The things we need to be aware of is the availability for everybody. Is it available for everybody? The competence, the knowledge that you need to handle this new technology, that's the basic thing. The Swedish Society I think that's also 2 decades ago, but don't take that exactly, put a lot of resources into giving people in general a knowledge about computers. How do we deal with computers in our daily lives? This is not only for those who can afford a private course, who can do it on job. This is for everybody. So there was a training, nationwide training, and also not least giving incentives for people to buy computers, mm-hmm. financial. So all of a sudden, there was a broader acceptance of computers in the country, and that's my third point. This requires some kind of dialogue, some kind of process that involves different actors, businesses, of course, enterprises, but the society and the workers, the employees and other actors, so that we have a process where everybody feels confident. This is also good for me.
That's great. So one of the ways of thinking about what you just described is, should the priority be on protecting jobs or on protecting workers?
No, protecting jobs that's a dead-end street.
That's a dead-end street.
It's a dead-end street, but you cannot tell the market what to do or not to do. These inventions, they will happen. It will occur. So, and that is why we focus in the Swedish society on protecting individuals, giving them. I mean, jobs will be lost. It's inevitable. My own company was closed because ABB decided this plant is going to be closed, and so we were 300-400 people losing our jobs. And the point at that time is we cannot decide them not to close. We did fight. We did give them a fight for 3 years. Yeah. But after that, we saw this is going to happen. So what do we do now? How do we help the individuals to new job? Some could go from this company to another company directly. Some needed training. Yeah. And so you provide them with training. You ask the company, you will support this process. The society needs to support this process. And some went out in unemployment. And during that unemployment time, they need to know, I can make a living. Yeah. I need the financial security during this time. And make this unemployment term as short as possible, going back to job. But that needs cooperation between the individual, your own responsibility, the company, the enterprises, the society.
And the state.
And the state.
So you were reskilled after your plant was closed to be prime minister?
Actually, yes. There was one course that nobody else saw that one, and I saw that. There's one for prime minister.
Sweden is a model for everyone,
yes.
Based on that alone. Yeah. Brad, the prime minister raised this question in his comments about the responsibility of the state, but also the responsibility of businesses. So I'd ask you, as a representative of a big employer around the world, how you think about the responsibility of businesses when jobs are lost. What's your responsibility to the workers?
Well, first of all, I think broadly speaking, there is a shared responsibility. And there is a responsibility that companies, businesses have. There is a responsibility for the government, the public sector, especially in the context of people losing jobs and needing new skills. There's a responsibility for educational institutions. And I think we have to recognize there's an individual responsibility as well. People need to learn, and it's really hard to learn if you're not prepared to study. So you have to bring all of these things together. Certainly when jobs are lost, I think that there's a role for healthy corporate responsibility by companies who are moving jobs or reducing jobs. We've happily mostly been in the situation of adding jobs, but not always. We reduced jobs in Finland over the past couple of years. And each time that happened, we made very significant multi-million-dollar investments in retraining programs and a variety of other initiatives sort of to encourage new job growth in related sectors. But I think the other responsibility that is worth all businesses undertaking is the responsibility to help their own employees keep learning. I just think in this day and age, it's impossible to be a healthy business if you don't have employees that are always learning. And therefore, it is part of the responsibility of a business to help its employees learn and grow.
Abid, I want to turn to you. So among the things that you offer, your company offers, is technology services, and this is moving some responsibilities between different countries. And so I guess the question for you is, how do you answer someone who says, my job has been outsourced or their services have been taken to another country, and how do you think about that?
Again, I'll just extend what Brad talked about. Is there is a responsibility to reskill, and we've learned from our experience that there are different horses for courses. So essentially, there is a demographic that is important. Entry-level job skilling, not necessarily reskilling, to jobs that are going to be the jobs of the future is important, and we contribute towards the STEM education, the college education, the statistics that he mentioned is extremely important. On the other hand, there is the 30 to 50 or 40 to 50 year demographic, where there is a couple of decades of employable life before you need to reskill them in skills that demographic can absorb and be productive. And we contribute towards that. But that is an area where a lot of work still needs to be done. Yeah. And then the target areas of which jobs are going to survive longer and hence have an inventory for those jobs and skill for those jobs. While there is a lot of investment happening in skilling, perhaps all the stakeholders and primarily the government could do more in making sure that at least public money is invested in areas where the skills deliver jobs. Okay. And I think that is primarily our focus on ensuring that we contribute towards reskilling so that we can absorb people back into there are a lot of jobs. There is equally an amount of capacity issue that we have in areas. You talked about artificial intelligence, data science, which kind of creates a lot of artificial intelligence. We could take as many data scientists as we could get. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of skill sets that are required, which are not available today.
Dambisa, I want to pull you in. The overarching question is, how can the downsides of globalization be offset? And so we're talking about one aspect of it in terms of looking after the workers and not just the jobs. Would you add anything to that?
Well, I think one thing that struck me is and this is not to needle Brad, but the statistics that you offered to us initially around job creation in the United States, as laudable as they are, that's just the United States. 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. For many countries, upwards of 85% of the country's GDP comes from agriculture. So when I say African or South American or Asian farmers have been put out, it's hundreds of millions of people who are out of sustainable living because of the globalized system that I would argue is far too still based on national interests and not on a global agenda. I don't think it's sufficient for us to just look at nation-state performance. I mean, I actually, by the way, just to be absolutely clear, I am a massive proponent of globalization. I do think it's a good thing, but I also recognize that it has had significant limitations. I mean, one of the sort of pipe dreams that I have is that if we could have institutions that were actually efficient at the global level, and a willingness by nation states to cede some of the responsibility around trade, around cross-border capital flows, which is why we have these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO in the first place. If we could cede some of the responsibility to them, I think we have a better shot of actually getting to globalization where there is less of this winner-take-all and winners and losers scenario that we found ourselves in.
Because they would be able to hold countries accountable for things like
Absolutely.
subsidies and
I mean,
blocking capital flows.
when was the last time anybody talked about the WTO since Trump has been elected? I mean, no one talks about it. Everybody's focused on what the United States protectionist regime will be. And I made the point earlier, but just to stress, this is not a Trump phenomena. For the past several, decades, certainly for the last decade, we have already seen protectionism on the rise. So it is very much of the nature. And I should also stress that, and we have a prime minister here, so he can talk to this, but this is very rational. So it's not that the politicians are somehow deluded or dumb. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they look at their constituents and, just look at the statistics around the voting patterns in the United States. I mean, I think it was a very attractive proposition because people need to improve their livelihoods. It goes back to the point of wanting to see a better generation, success in living standards in the succeeding generations.
I want to ask you a follow-up question, and that is, what is the role of growth and growth in jobs and economies in all of this? Xi Jinping yesterday was arguing that innovation and we need a new engine of global growth, and that is actually the way that globalization will succeed. Do you agree with that?
So I think there's sort of two parts to the question as I see it. One is sort of tactical short term, which I agree. I think that it's very appealing to say we need to come up with different ideas. And, we all talk about retooling. I mean, frankly, I ask myself every day, when is the last time I actually retooled? I'm very conscious of it, but what am I really doing? And it would be great to hear what this audience thinks. Really, what are we really doing to retool and reskill if our jobs became obsolete in the next 10 years? I think many people don't think about that because we're relatively comfortable. But the other point is that we have to also think about the structural issues that are continuing to erode the global growth challenge. And just coming to the specific point around the comments by President Xi, and I think this is a point that I hope, if nothing else, this is the point I'd like to leave with the audience, is that we are in a new environment. Public policy, certainly monetary and fiscal policy from the 20th century, but also the political strictures that have governed the 20th century no longer apply. And I think the salient point from President Xi yesterday was that the key drivers that have driven economic growth very successfully over the last century, just the sheer number of people, demographic shifts, commodities rising, those cannot no longer be depended upon to create economic growth in the subsequent years to come. And what we do need to think about is technology, and the questions around the jobless growth are very salient questions which Keynes was talking about in the 1930s. He's proposing a 15-hour work week by 2030. So those are real public policy questions. But the bottom line is that nobody should sit here comfortably and think, oh, we'll cut interest rates and we'll inflate the economy with infrastructure, fiscal spend, and that should do the trick. We're in a new environment, and the economy, and therefore the tools to address the economy have shifted very considerably. So I would say the growth question is still on the table.
So you mentioned this question of reskilling and how everyone needs to think about how they're going to be prime minister one day, or how to keep improving their skills. So I want to turn to that. What are the skills that are needed for the jobs of the future? And we're going to go to another person. This is Sneha in India. Before turning back to the panel, we're going to play the video of Sneha.
As we get into the globalized world, more often than not, we end up interacting with people from all different countries. And hence, it's important to understand the power of communication. And yes, these have to be instilled right at the beginning of our schools, so that the workforce tomorrow is equipped with both the arts and the sciences to take us ahead.
So she's making the point that, the sort of the facile answer to all of this is that everyone's children should study STEM subjects and be computer coders, and this is the way that if everyone did this, then our economies would be growing even faster. Abid, I want to put this question to you. There's an argument that the skills that are hardest for AI and computers to replace are another set of skills, a different set of skills, softer skills, more human competencies. Those might be even more secure in the future. How do you see that?
It's very interesting because, we need more of unicorns than we've ever had. So, we call it, inside Wipro, we need more of T and Pi kind of people who are broad in a number of skills and then deep in one or two. And we've done a very interesting, I wouldn't call it experiment because now it's kind of scaled up, but we had this traditional way of training people where we got them into the classroom and stuff like that. And then we realized that some of the skills that is required need more practice, almost apprenticeship, before they can be put into the industry. And we started a whole program which, to simply explain it, it starts with something like a Khan Academy, where by video you self-learn, and then we put a crowdsourcing platform. When we started it, it took a little while, but with millennials especially, they jump on it. So you give out work, which is packets of 8 to 40 hours, which people just practice. These are old programs and activity that we might have done for customers. We would just anonymize it and put it in there. And they practice and then they do. And then, now what we are realizing, and I think the market is not ready for it yet, but eventually all the work could be literally crowdsourced. And the video very rightly talked about people being able to collaborate and communicate across boundaries, because those crowdsourcing platforms today, Wipro owns a crowdsourcing platform, which has 1.4 million developers as members. And not only we are able to tap into that talent who train themselves, but also the price point at which we can then deliver code is an order of magnitude lower. So it's not only the jobs which are being replaced by technology are at risk, but if I look at the implication of that, the 170,000 Wiproites who work for Wipro today, their jobs will be at risk, because now these 1.4 million coders who are across boundaries, and some of them are homemakers, some of them are just part-time amateur enthusiasts who, in the day do something very different and spend a couple of hours at night writing programs. So the point I'm making is the future of work is very different, and the skills that are required to be able to be successful in that situation is not only the expertise which traditional skills and competencies have provided, but the ability to communicate and collaborate.
Okay, so you said broad and deep. When you mean broad, people who are able to communicate and collaborate.
Absolutely.
Okay. Brad, I want to ask you the same question. What are the skills and jobs needed for the future?
Well, I think it helps from a skills perspective to start at a general level, and I'd almost say there's 3 categories. There are digital skills, there are non-digital technical skills, and there are soft skills. And I think for each job, one can sort of ask what collection of these skills do you need to blend. I think you then need to go a lot deeper. And to me, one of the most interesting questions one can spend time thinking about is to focus on a single economic area, take the EEA. Why is it that there are some countries in the EEA, like Germany and Switzerland, that have a youth unemployment rate below 5%? And other countries, whether it's France or Spain or Romania, where you have a youth unemployment rate above 20%. 20% or in some cases, and it's sometimes far higher. It can't be explained in terms of protectionism, because you're talking about a common trade area. And what you fundamentally have are different approaches to education. And when I really look at what works in Switzerland, there are 2 things that jump out. First, the education system is very much designed with an end view of the jobs that are being created in the economy and an understanding from businesses of the skills that are needed for those jobs. And then that informs very specific forms of curriculum. There's 270 different apprenticeship tracks in the Swiss education system. And that largely reflects the fact that there's 270 different sets of skills. And the big differentiation is frankly in the non-digital technical space. But it does require that level of specificity to really get alignment with what people are learning, with then the ability to go fill jobs. And what these show is that if you get that right, you can do an awful lot of good.
That's great. I'm going to come to the Prime Minister in a second, but so you're saying that they're technical, they're digital skills, they're technical skills, and they're
You
software.
might say a digital skill is a technical skill.
Yeah.
But
More IT.
But I think one, of course, I believe in the importance of digital skills, in part because there's a digital element to almost every job these days, and that is becoming even more the case. But I think it's a big mistake to just think that the only thing the world needs is more digital skills.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at welders, and there are more advanced forms of welding, and mastering those skills, and somebody said it earlier, getting the credential to prove to an employer that you also have that skill is also extremely important, and we shouldn't lose sight of those non-digital technical skills.
So I have 2 teenage children. So which of those 3 categories should I be directing them to?
Well, let me say
maximum
this.
lifetime
Well,
employment?
if you go back to your, what is
Yeah.
the one thing that computers will be the worst at doing over the lifetime of your kids? It's actually the soft skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think, for example, my first job was as a lawyer in 1986. At that time, there was 1 secretary for every 2 lawyers. Now there's 1 secretary for every 10 lawyers. Why? Because computers have replaced a lot of what the secretaries did. But think about the soft skills it took to support 2 lawyers at a time compared to the soft skills it takes to support 10 lawyers at a time. You better believe that the secretaries that are successful today are much stronger in those soft skills, and I've got to believe that will continue to be
That's
the
an
case.
interesting point. I want to pull you in now. What do you think about the skills that are most, that are needed in tomorrow's economy?
Well, first, I think it's very hard to decide exactly what jobs will be there in the future and will not be there. But I agree with much have been said here, and it's about categories of knowledge. Yeah. So, with my experience from the industry, we've seen over the years that you've had to develop from, let's say, only, which is not only, learning a machine and how to handle that machine, into also taking contact with customers, meaning that you need a social competence. In a global market, you need more language training. And you need, I mean, for the future, we know we're now reaching a new stage with 3D printing. There will be new business models, and what kind of competence would that require? So it's hard perhaps to be detailed, but those kind of competences that we're not thinking about. A third one, I mean, Sweden, we've been fortunate. We've been receiving people from Europe in the 50s and the 60s, Italy, Greece, and during the 90s, Serbia, for example, during the 70s, Chile, Argentina. Some of those people, they came to Sweden, but some of them went back. So now we have people living in Sweden that are from Chile. They know the culture in Chile, traditions in Chile, and we have people now coming from Syria and others. So we will have competence on culture things, languages. How does it work in other parts of this huge global market? So those kind of competences will also be required. And I do believe, just to end up, that the education must be closer to labor market, must be closer to enterprises. And some can be done through apprenticeship, that is obvious. But although when you have education that is not apprenticeship model, you need to put it closer to the labor market, closer to the enterprises, so that when we educate young people, we know that they will have the right skills when they leave the school. We did that as a trade union together with the employers. We developed something we call Technology College, which we made sure that these young people, when they walk in there, they come out with right competence, and the enterprises knew it as well. So that's, I think that is one
Great,
thing
that's
as
a
well.
great point. Dambisa, I want to go back to an area that you talked about earlier, and that was the impact on developing countries. You talked specifically about agriculture, among other things. But one of the questions I think that underlies the discussion of globalization is to what extent are the kind of stepping stone industries that have made possible a lot of the development in places like China that you were referring to. What are the prospects for those?
For the industries in places like China. you mean?
Yeah, and the sort of model of development that we've seen where there are these stepping stone industries, thanks to greater integration in the global economy, is that something we can?
So I think that something you said in the question actually explains why we still have a problem with the way we think about things. There is no model of development that I would argue is valid. The sort of trajectory of you do some agriculture and then you do a bit of manufacturing and then all of a sudden you turn into a service country and then lo and behold you become R&D. That just doesn't work in practice. So the United States is a great example of some of the issues that we're dealing with right now. In 1900, which I think is not that long ago. I mean, my parents differ, but 1900 is just a few years ago. We had 60% of the American population was involved in agriculture in some fashion.
Yeah.
Today, it's less than 3%. And we know there were push and pull factors, dragged the American workforce into manufacturing through World War I, World War II, certainly World War II. And then we moved from manufacturing into services. Today, 80% of the American workforce is involved in services. I'm not going to sit here and speculate on what the next big thing is, but I think the conversation a moment ago around what skills will take us into the R&D era, which is what economists think is the next leg, I think that type of model just doesn't actually really fly. And it's partly for good news. I come from Zambia. It's a small country landlocked in Africa. I think most Zambians will not tolerate a situation where we want to walk through these different stages. People are interconnected and they would like to immediately be in the service sector. They immediately want to be doing R&D. And so I think that there is no model of development in that sense, which is making it much more difficult for public policymakers. I will also say, just to underscore a point that I made earlier, I think that as long as we keep referring to either national governments or to globalization without really thinking about buttressing the global institutions, which, by the way, I should be very clear, I actually despise bureaucracy, but I think that if you really want to have globalization, you really do need a broader frame within which to operate. It's not surprising to me, nor to many people in this room, that President Xi would stand up and say globalization is a great thing. Of course it is, because 700 million people in China have been moved out of poverty, largely because of globalization for China. But there are other countries that don't see that as a winning solution, and I don't think that they're getting as much airtime as perhaps is necessary. And I think the consequences of that will be felt in the years to come. And we're feeling it a lot in the West, but I mean, we really haven't seen the shoe drop, I don't believe, in the emerging markets, which is what I'm very concerned about.
That's really interesting. And one of the questions is, and this is an area that you've written a lot about, is China's leadership of a global economy and what that would mean in terms of institutions. And
yeah, and I mean, let's just be clear. China is a poor developing country. I mean, there's no illusion about that. People talk a lot about it being the second largest economy in GDP terms today. That's great, but in per capita income terms, it's poorer than a lot of countries in South America and Africa. And so they have a lot of transitionary work to do. They're not going to be the reserve currency, probably not in my lifetime. They have a lot of issues in terms of the capital markets at home. They are doing some amazing things in terms of foreign direct investment and trade, and they have done a lot of outreach. But I think the expectations from an institutional perspective that China will be a leader when they are themselves grappling through developmental questions that we're raising here, I think that's a misplaced
the expectations are. I'm going to pause here just for a second to say that in just a few minutes, we're going to turn to the audience for reactions and questions. So if you have some, we'll be passing microphones around so you can prepare for that. Before we do that, I want to ask a question which probably has been answered, but not quite as directly, which is for the developed countries, is there any turning back on globalization? Brad, I want to ask you about this. More than half of Microsoft's revenue, as I noted earlier, is outside of the US. Presumably, you're not lobbying for tighter borders. There's discussion, as Ambisa noted, of an America First approach as the sort of political mantra of the new administration. Is it possible to take that approach, and would it involve going back on globalization?
Well, to some degree, people have been asking that question since 1900, as you pointed out. I don't know that big trends can be reversed, but certainly large phenomena can be managed. And one thing needs to think about how to manage them. I would certainly agree that one needs strong global norms in a variety of areas. One needs global institutions in certain areas. One needs the rule of law at a whole variety of levels, including, trade laws that are global, as we have them, but are enforced in a consistent and rigorous way and are interpreted in a generally similar way on a global basis. There are other aspects of globalization that I think arguably need to be managed at a local level. This whole notion of understanding who the winners and losers are likely to be, what one can do to address the needs of people who are not benefiting. And I very much agree that one needs to actually understand that at the end of the day, the world is going to be better if emerging markets have growing opportunity and industrial, more developed countries have opportunity as well. And I don't think you're going to get a big disagreement about that.
Yeah.
The problem at the moment is there's just a lot of people in a lot of countries, whether it's the United States or Zambia, who say, well, I get the broad message, but I'm not seeing it work in my hometown or for my family.
For me personally.
Yeah.
So there is this negative perception of globalization. What can be done to combat that as a political or a political leader in your case, or as a business leader?
First, I agree. We have to manage. It's not in a broader perspective. Globalization cannot be reversed. We've been on the moon for 50 years. Tell our young people that you have to be locked in your own countries. It's impossible. It won't work that way. But we have to manage in a much, much better way. What is lacking now, in my view, is a global process. One of the basic ingredients in the Swedish progress over the years, and I'm talking decades, we actually moved from being one of Europe's poorest countries in the late 1800s, early 1900s, into one of the richest countries. And despite all the problems, we have also one of the more equal societies in the world. We do have problems. I'm not sitting here saying everything is perfect. Far from it. But in a global economy, and that has been based on a social dialogue, a trust in the society, that not only politicians, not only CEOs or employers, but also the employees and the civil society has taken part in this progress. They have been given a platform. So we have a social dialogue. Now, we do not have that on the global level. And we cannot dream back and say we can fix everything at the national level. That's not the point. But, you're right. How do we help one another to make sure this is a global perspective we have a global prosperous future. It's global. It's not only for Swedes. I know also if it's good for you, it's good for me as well. So how do we find that? We need a structure for that, and I initiated something that I call a global deal. A global deal is not trying to transform a model from one country to the what it wouldn't work. But I think those basic ingredients that we talk to one another, between governments, businesses, employees, and other academia as well, with this huge knowledge. How do we make this work? And we need that process on a global scale. It doesn't mean that we can sit in one room and decide over the world. No. On the African continent, there is one kind of, not only one, but the culture is different. The traditions is different. The history is different from Sweden. But people talking to one another, engaging in how the country can develop, needs to be done at the global scale. And that's what we lack right now. This global deal was launched last autumn in New York. when the General Assembly was open again. We now have 11 countries so far that have joined. We're doing it in cooperation with OECD, ILO. I have a dialogue with the IMF, with the World Bank. I want other global organizations to take part, and so we can figure out how can we make this work, so that everybody feels, going from this concern that this is a loss for me, I'm not on board, into a positive view on the future that I am on board.
Great. We're going to go to Dambisa, and then we'll take questions.
So I think one other piece worth thinking about is that if we look at both business and economics, but as well as the political environment, one of the takeaways, certainly for me, for the last 10 years, is that there's a serious problem around myopia. And both in terms of short-term decision-making with businesses. So if you just look in the last year, the majority of companies in the S&P 500 have paid up over 100% of dividends versus the retained earnings. So short-termism, and I spend a lot of time with my own CEOs talking about what we might be able to do to think about reinvesting in the future and not be subject to some of the pressures, which I'm sure the gentleman sitting on either side of me will be much more au fait to speak on. But the more important point vis-a-vis globalization and our prospects for economic growth are around myopia in the political system. And I will not offer a list of suggestions for how to remedy and think about democratic processes as somebody who believes in democracy. But I do think what we have seen, certainly in the fact in the last year, in terms of the elections and potentially what's going to happen this year, I think we really need to revisit the framing and the political processes, particularly in the leading developed countries and democratic countries, around how we think about the democratic process vis-a-vis the long-term problems that we're talking about here, whether it's education, infrastructure, healthcare burdens, pension funds, et cetera. Those are all long-term intergenerational problems. And yet we have electoral systems where in the United States an election every 2 years, which I think actually skews a lot of the narrative and the issues around globalization. And one final point, people are to the question around, do we think it's likely that there'll be a reversal? I just want to remind everybody that after the 1929 crash, Smoot-Hawley put 3,200, this is American, put 3,200 tariffs on the United States goods and services. And so I think without a clear path and a clear agenda, and I think tongue-in-cheek economists say, well, the way we got bailed out of that was through World War II. I'm not proposing that at all. But what I will say is that if we don't get our skates on and get serious about really figuring out how to deal with these very structural problems, we could end up in a situation where governments are essentially forced into corners and they find most appealing the idea of having protectionist policies.
So let's get our skates on. We're going to take questions now. If you can raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Maybe we start right here. And if you could just say your name and if you represent an organization. If you can keep it really brief, we just have a few minutes.
Thank you. My name is Alim. I'm from the Global Shapers community in Perth, Australia. My question is to you, Prime Minister. In the case of the United States, manufacturing has doubled. I think that was one of the stats since the mid-'80s, but with 1/3 fewer workers. So they're not necessarily losing their jobs to immigrants, the Mexicans, as was often said in the last year, but to technology. So what role do policymakers have in ensuring that they can better communicate the situation and context so that audiences have a better grasp on globalization?
Now, going back to what I said about the shared responsibility, we'll know that will happen. And if we do not, if we have a negative attitude toward technology, that will be even worse. We know that. Going back to Spinning Jenny, that what was happened. They crashed these textile machines because we're taking away the jobs. But it kept on developing. So the shared responsibility is my issue, as I said, from the enterprise, the individual, the society. I think the key thing here is that people do not want to be felt left alone. I'm on my own. Because the moment you're on your own only, I think you feel that you're not going to be a winner. Only a few, perhaps. But if we're in this together, If we're in this together in the enterprises, in the companies, we will help one another. If you lose your job, it'll be your responsibility to take the education that you will be provided, yes. But the enterprise will also help you to make sure you will reach that new job. The society will be there. So if we have this win-win-win situation, we will work this together. If we have that kind of system, and once again, that was what happened with Sweden, was also with the fast change and a positive attitude to change. We wanted change. And it took us from being very poor to very rich. But you need to make sure that everyone is included. Because the moment you say, well, you perhaps can get an education, but you cannot. The moment you say that, that's a dangerous situation. So if you include everybody, make sure we have the shared responsibility. We make sure also people that lose their job because of technology can get a new job.
Okay, we have time for just one quick question. We're going to go right here. If you can keep it very brief, we just have.
Okay,
very
my
short.
name is Lisette Brisgaard. I'm the president of the Danish Confederation of Trade Unions. You haven't been speaking very much about trade union and what role they can play. But I want to not state a question, but just tell you that if we have to solve this problem with the globalization, we have to see prosperity, we have to see equality, and we have to see that the security which you have been talking about is there for the people. That would help us very much to go further.
Great. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and what I'd like to do is to ask each of our panelists to just give us a very quick sort of forward-looking, what are you taking away in terms of lessons for this fundamental question of how can globalization be done better for more people? Abid, maybe you start that off.
So I think two things. One is, as I kind of sat through the panel discussion, while technology has to a great extent been the reason for some of the conversation that we had today, technology is also a great enabler to solve the problem that we're talking about today, and perhaps use of technology to be able to reskill people more and make the resources to education available globally. And second thing I think, which is extremely important, is as Prime Minister talked about, is we are all in it together. I think the haves and the have-nots, the income inequality that globalization or technology creates a level of societal anxiety and frustration, which could have impacts that which would be much difficult to deal with. So I think bringing all the stakeholders together and all of us being together in this is what I would take away from this.
Dambisa, quickly.
Very quickly, I think that we need to really think hard about how we craft a message that globalization is a good thing. And the only way you do that is by making sure all people are around the table, all representation is around the table. Remember, 80% of world GDP is now from the emerging markets. To have institutions that are basically focused on and dominated by 12% of the world's population does not reflect the interests of many other people around the world, whether it's through labor or capital, who do need to have a voice in those discussions.
Great, Brad.
Just two things briefly. First, I think the big lesson from 2016 is the value and the importance of, frankly, understanding the real needs of people who feel that they're not benefiting in an era of, call it, globalization and automation, and understanding their problems with a level of specificity, whether it's a farmer in Zambia or a displaced auto worker in Sweden. And then second, I endorse the sense, which we haven't talked as much about, is the role that technology can play, technology tools, in helping people learn, helping people develop and obtain credentials to certify their learning, helping people identify the jobs that are open and get matched to them, and helping economic development planners understand the skills that are needed in their region and base more economic planning on it.
Mr. Prime Minister, a final thought.
The thing that I believe during this discussion, thank you so much is that it's even more clear for me that we have to make globalization global. It's not global enough. Because if we look at this, that we need to get everyone on board, not least developing countries, we have a huge possibility, huge I'm talking to several of the governments in Africa, for example, the African continent. They want to modernize the agriculture, the food industry, and everything. There's a win-win situation here. Can invest in that, and businesses also in the Western country can benefit. So make it more global, take responsibility at the global level, as I said, with the global deal, but you need also to work at the national level. You need to work with education, training, social security, all the things that we and to end up to just support one of the audience who mentioned the trade unions. I think we cannot, I said it this morning at another discussion, there's no way, there's no shortcut. We need to make sure that enterprises, the employers' organizations, and the trade unions strengthen the social dialogue with the support of the government. That will be the most important ingredients.
So we all need to get our skates or our skis.
Skates on.
Or
we love that in the Nordic
whatever
countries. Yes.
So we're going to end here. I'd like to thank this wonderful panel for really plowing through these issues to some answers. I'd like to thank the audience here in the room and also the people who've been watching us on Facebook, on Quartz, and on Yahoo Finance. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.